I'm very grateful to George and to Heather for having conceived this splendid enterprise and for having invited me, or rather, as we were saying earlier, gently coerced me to participate in it. Apart from my admiration for them and for their initiative, I was moved to come also by my attraction to this great university and this great college, which I first visited a dozen years ago. Much of what we've been able to do in Italian studies at Notre Dame has been inspired by and accomplished in collaboration with our wonderful colleagues here in England, and beginning from Cambridge. Now, as George knows, I don't think there is a vertical link within each set of corresponding cantos in the three canticles. The way Dante constructs things is not quite so obvious. Dante is more difficult, more subtle than that. But George and Heather are perfectly aware of that objection, and yet they thought that this enterprise was worth pursuing, and they're absolutely right. For two main reasons. One is that in some cases there certainly is such a vertical correspondence, which Dante clearly meant us to reflect on. A few cases in which the vertical correspondence is evident are the canto 1s, the 3s, the 6s, the 9s, the 27s, the 33s. These play on Dante's beloved 3 and 9, or mark great parallel transitions in the three canticles, or focus on one theme, and so on. But how do we know how many of these vertical correspondences there are until we look? So it's worth looking. The second reason is that even where there clearly is not a consciously constructed vertical correspondence, looking for one makes us read the cantos in a new way, bringing new details and themes into relief. That too can lead to discoveries or enrich our understanding. The canto 12s support both contentions, I think. They're not, as far as I can tell, linked vertically in any conscious way, and yet looking at them as a set has been intriguing and perhaps fruitful. You'll be the judges of that. Let's refresh these canto 12s in our memory. In Inferno 12, we have recently come through a key transition, passing through the gates of Dis in Inferno 9. This transition has immersed us in the realm of malice, or injury, or injustice, malizia, injuria, of love so misdirected that it pursues as a good what is actually evil, the destruction of self and others. In Inferno 11, Virgil and Dante had paused at the edge of a high cliff among a last group of heretics, apparently those who thought Christ had only one nature, only the human, and not also the divine. And there, while they accustomed themselves to the stench wafting up from lower hell beneath the cliff, Virgil had given an account of how hell was structured. In particular, he had explained that the first circle at the foot of the cliff contains the violent, arranged in three concentric rings. The first, or outermost ring, holds the violent against others, whether in their person or in their possessions. That is, it holds murderers, those who wound others unjustly, pillagers, arsonists, plunderers, spoilers, and the like, in distinct groups, omicide e ciascun che malfiere, guastatori e predor. This is brute force. It does not involve an element of fraud or cunning, of the misuse of intellect that will be punished further down in hell, where the cunning thieves and swindlers and traitors will be. It is this first circle, this first ring of the circle of violence that we will be exploring in Inferno 12. Inferno 12 is thus the first of 5 cantos treating the realm of violence. In the next 4, the pilgrim crosses the other 2 rings, of the violent against themselves, suicides and squanderers, and of the violent against God and nature, blasphemers, sodomites, and usurpers. Then, at the end of Inferno 16, the pilgrim will come to the edge of another cliff, with beneath him the realm of fraud. Inferno 12 begins at the very edge of the steep cliff that leads down from the area of the heretics to the circle of violence. At the edge over the chasm lies the Minotaur, half human, half bull, conceived from Pasiphae's lust. Virgil taunts the Minotaur, reminding him how Theseus had killed him. The Minotaur hops and bites himself in blind rage, making it easy for the travelers to get by him. The Minotaur was guarding a sort of passage down the cliff formed by a landslide at Uina. Virgil explains that the landslide was caused by an earthquake that occurred just before someone came and harrowed Limbo. We understand that he means the earthquake at the crucifixion. Virgil has his own explanation of the earthquake. He thought perhaps the universe felt love, and he cites the theory of Empedocles, who held that order was caused by forces of discord, which held the elements separated in a balanced tension. When those forces were overcome by concord or love, the universe collapsed in chaos in endless cycles. Now Dante and Virgil come to a river of boiling blood, the first ring of the circle of violence, boiling those who by violence do injury to others, qual che per violenza in altrui noccia. The poet breaks into an invective against cupidigia, greed, and perhaps against mad wrath, ira fall, if the reading is uncertain, as the source of this violence and this boiling. Between the foot of the cliff and the river of blood, Centaurs, armed with arrows, run in ranks, shooting any sinners who rise above their allotted depth in the blood. A platoon of 3 of them comes to patrol, Chiron at the center, flanked by Nessus and Pholus. Chiron is the grave teacher of Achilles and other classical heroes. Nessus is the impetuous figure who tried to make off with Deianira and was killed by a poisoned arrow of Hercules. Pholus is kindred to Nessus, a wrathful type who was also killed, accidentally, by one of Hercules' poisoned arrows. Nessus impetuously addresses Virgil and Dante, but Virgil says he will speak only to Chiron. As they come near, Chiron too draws his bow, uncovering his mouth with the arrow's notch, and observes to his companions that Dante is alive. His feet disturb the rocks. Now at Chiron's breast, where Chiron's 2 natures of horse and man conjoin, Virgil asks Chiron for a centaur to guide them and to carry Dante across the river on his back. Chiron appoints Nessus as the escort, and Nessus acts as a tour guide. Nessus tells Dante and Virgil that the souls sunk to their eyebrows are tyrants who took to blood and plunder. Dier nel sangue nell'aver piglio. They include Alexander the Great and Dionysius of Syracuse from the ancient world, and Ezzelino da Romano and Obizo d'Este from contemporary Italy. Nessus leads them to another group sunk to their necks and points out one soul set apart, Guy de Montfort, who for vengeance murdered his cousin, Henry of Cornwall, in God's bosom, that is, in church, at Mass, during the elevation of the host. In Nessus's words, Guy clove in 2 the heart that on the Thames still drips with blood. That is, that still calls for vengeance in England. Next, they come upon other souls, only immersed to their stomachs, and others only to their feet, all unidentified and nameless. At that shallow point, Nessus and his charges cross the river. Nessus explains that as the circle of the river progresses, it grows deeper again, back towards the tyrants, where, he says, you will also find Attila the Hun, Pyrrhus of Epirus, and Sextus Pompeius, all perhaps plunderers of Rome, joined by 2 contemporary Italian highwaymen, Rinier da Corneto and Rinier Pazzo. His assignment accomplished, Nessus abruptly stops talking and recrosses the river. Let's make some observations about this canto. We have a kind of fracture in nature, a harsh cliff, a giant landslide on which rests a monster of nature, a Minotaur. The Minotaur, who seems to preside over the entire circle of violence, is a composite creature, half bull, half man. He is a product of unbridled and debased human desire, the animal nature of man warring with and triumphing over the rational, manipulating the intellect to its animal ends. In fact, the Minotaur was conceived when Pasiphae had the ingenious craftsman Daedalus make her a wooden cow so that she could satisfy her lust for a bull. It is Daedalus who then makes the cunning labyrinth, the intellectual maze that contains the Minotaur, who yet must be fed with human flesh, 7 lads and 7 lasses each year, until Theseus threads the maze with Ariadne's help and kills the monster. Theseus thus becomes a figure of Christ, a liberator, who, following the intellect to its proper end, heals the destructive war between the animal and the rational dimensions of man. The pilgrim Dante slipping by the Minotaur here becomes another Theseus. At the center of the comedy, at its very heart, Virgil will explain that everything in creation is moved by love, by the innate thirst of each finite thing to fulfill the potential of its nature, the greatest happiness possible for it. For humans, that potential, and therefore that thirst, is infinite. As conscious, that is, rational creatures, humans can come to know themselves as one with the ground of all finite reality, thus encompassing and knowing as themselves everything that exists. That is perfect love, the fruition of human desire in perfect understanding and self-knowledge, union with God. Disaster, profound disharmony, self-destruction come when humans seek to satiate their infinite thirst with finite things. But that readily happens by their very nature as animals who are conscious, animals who can be satiated only by infinity. Hence the apparent divide, the war between the rational and the animal in the human form. Humans seek to devour the world through the senses instead of feeding on the divine within themselves. So it is cupidigia, infinite thirst, seeking to feed on the finite, that gives birth to the Minotaur, to violence and injustice. At the center of the comedy, and also in Inferno 11, Virgil also explains that human desire focused excessively on finite goods is relatively innocent. It's simply incontinence, wanting too much of a good thing, too much stuff, too much food, too much sex. But the failure to know oneself, to understand one's true nature as a human being, can lead one to see everything and everyone as in competition with oneself in the quest to feed on the world, in a kind of zero-sum game. This is malice. It is to seek the destruction of others, that is, to seek evil or harm or injustice as an end in itself. Hence violence and fraud, the world within the gates of Dis. So the landslide, the ruina that the Minotaur guards and that provides the passage from those who could not recognize the divine nature of Christ to the circle of violence, takes on more significance. The landslide was caused by the earthquake at the crucifixion, when the universe did indeed feel love, but not because of endless cycles of natural causes, as Virgil conjectures. The ruina is the infernal evidence of the self-sacrifice of Christ, the perfect love that satiates man, won by surrendering all attachment to the finite, by being willing to sacrifice even one's own animal form. It is human consciousness shaking itself free from the obsessive attachment to finite things so that it can discover its own freedom, its potential infinity. It's to know oneself as not only a mortal animal creature, but also as one with God. The mystery of Christ, the mystery of man, the mystery and center of all the meaning of the world is that those two, the human and the divine, flesh and spirit, the world and its ground, are not two. they are in a profound sense one. The first in each pair has no being of its own, apart from the second. This mystery is the revelation of the Incarnation. To surrender to the Incarnation is to know that mystery as oneself. So the Minotaur is a parody of incarnation, of the true nature of man, an emblem of a massive failure of self-knowledge, the eclipse of spirit by flesh, of the rational by the animal. This is frustration, rage, impotence, a blind, insane hopping around. It is to bite oneself uselessly rather than sacrificing oneself for liberation. It is pride, to experience oneself as an autonomous, self-subsistent, finite entity, dependent on no one and nothing, for whom everything other is to be either devoured or destroyed. Clearly, there is a political and social consequence to this blindness. It is injustice, strife, and violence, the failure of humans to become one, to form empire under the rule of law. The result is even worse when such blind and greedy souls become rulers. They are tyrants, like the first 4 souls named in the River of Blood, or plunderers, leaders of ravaging, pillaging armies or bands, like the last 5 souls named, who fed on ancient Rome and on modern Tuscany. Tyrants oppose empire through self-interest, subjecting law to greed. They negate human freedom, the greatest gift of the divine to man, and they cancel human identity by seeking to impose their own. In between the two groups of the plunderers and the tyrants are the mere murderers, emblematized by Guy de Montfort, who reduced politics to vendetta, cleaving a human heart at the elevation of the host, at the moment when the human, through self-sacrifice, is revealed as divine. All these souls are faceless and do not speak. Human identity and consciousness is drowned in blood. Language, and therefore all human community, fails when the soul of consciousness, of spirit, is eclipsed by the body, the flesh it has assumed. The failure to recognize Christ leads to the ultimate act of violence, the crucifixion. The blood of Christ's self-sacrifice, unrecognized, is one with an inexhaustible human thirst for blood. Through greed, blindness, we come to drink blood instead of the water of life. The immersion in blood is also a parody of baptism. The Centaurs, who become the central focus of the canto, are an extension of the contrapasso, its completion. They're the only non-devil custodians in all of hell, assigned only to this ring of the violent against others. And here they hunt humans, as in the world they hunted animals. Humans have indeed become animals here. As the early commentators Benvenuto and Boccaccio and others point out, centaurs, who are human to the navel and horse below that, look like mounted cavalry. They're an image of the mercenary mounted troops that pillaged Italy at the behest of tyrants, hunting men. It's as if the tyrants here in the River of Blood are being hunted by their own mounted mercenary troops. In fact, these centaurs are a mini military. They run in ranks, they dispatch exploratory platoons, they have a commander. The exploratory platoon is a mini trinity, Chiron flanked by Nessus and Phobos. The latter two are your standard centaurs, born from an attempted rape, XII trying to ravish a cloud that looked like Juno. Unruly sorts, they tried to carry off the women at the wedding of Perithous until stopped by Hercules. Nessus, who will carry Dante on his back, was trying to carry off Hercules' consort Deianira when Hercules killed him. But centaurs are clever. Nessus tricked Deianira into giving Hercules a robe soaked with Nessus' own poisoned blood, thus getting his revenge. Fet disset la vendetta egli stesso. Humans consume themselves with their thirst for vengeance, which is a parody of justice, divine vengeance. Again, we have the tension or split between the two natures of man, the rational and the animal. The rational being made to serve the animal, lust and vengeance. Hercules, killer and subduer of centaurs, and of all three of these centaurs, is another Christ figure, a healer and redeemer. Poisoned by Nessus, Hercules burns off his flesh to become divine, an image perhaps for Dante's own purifying pilgrimage. Chiron is a little different. He's a son of Saturn, raised by Apollo, expert in medicine, music, and archery, and the teacher of heroes, including Achilles and Theseus and Hercules, though it was one of Hercules' arrows that killed him too. In fact, our Chiron here is thoughtful and grave and wise. He alone notices that Dante is alive. The other centaurs are kept in line by him. But Dante emphasizes his double nature. Chiron gazes at his breast where the two natures are conjoined, or rather associated, not fused as one, dove le due nature son consorti. This divide is again an image of failed revelation, the failure to know body as the soul made visible, matter as spirit, to recognize consciousness made flesh, the human as divine. This intellect dissociated from oneself, from one's animal being, is part of the torment of the violent, that both makes violence possible and punishes it. The rational dimension of the violent souls, in a sense, is running on the bank of the river alongside them, keeping them immersed in blood. It lays out the split within themselves. Dante observes in the Convivio that we must ride, cavalcare, our primitive appetites with reason. But it is only the fusion of reason and passion, of our higher and lower natures united as one, that drives the perfection of human beings, not the separation of those. One of the ironies of the canto is that the traditionally bestial centaurs, as they are in other literature, have here become human, to guard the humans who have become bestial. While Inferno 12 is the first of the 5 cantos of the Circle of Violence, Purgatorio 12 is the last of 3 cantos devoted to the terrace of pride, the first terrace of Purgatory proper. Pride is the foundational vice from which all others and all sin flows. As we saw, it's a failure of self-knowledge. It is to conceive oneself only as an autonomous and self-subsistent finite entity, resulting in insatiable desire, cupidigia. In the first 2 cantos of the Ledge, Dante has seen a triptych of carved reliefs depicting examples of humility, with David, the singer of God, at the center. Then, in the next canto, 11, he has met a trio of penitent souls with an illuminator of texts at the center, Oderisi da Gubbio. The theme of the Ledge is artistic representation and artistic pride, related to names and meaning, to identity. The canto 12, Purgatory 12, opens with Dante sharing in the penance of pride, bent low by the side of his fellow artist Oderisi, as if they were oxen yoked together. Prompted by Virgil's Ulyssian exhortation, he mentions varcare, ali, remi, all words associated with Ulysses. Dante stands and looks at the ground he is walking on. There he sees that the pavement is figurato, figured, like the floor tombs in churches, except with greater sembianza, secondo l'artificio, verisimilitude because of their artifice or artistry, given that they were made by God. With this artistically self-conscious terzina, Dante introduces the most artistically self-conscious passage of the entire comedy, a verbal account of 13 floor engravings with exactly 1 tercet devoted to each. Inscribed in the account is an acrostic. The first 4 tercets each begin with the word vedea, the next 4 with o, and the next 4 with mostrava. The 3 lines of the 13th tercet begin with those 3 words in order as a kind of summation. The initial letters spell V-O-M, wom, man. The human is inscribed through verbal signs in the verbal representation of these visual images, whose subject is the punishment of human pride. The grouping of 36 verses plus 3 evokes the Sistina, one of the most self-conscious of medieval literary forms. as well as the Trinity, whose image man is. The images described alternate as in parallel side-by-side columns between Old Testament and pagan or mythological examples. The first four examples are Lucifer, Briareus, the giants, and Nimrod, heroic challengers of the divine destroyed. The next four are presumptuous mortals, Niobe, who in maternal pride defied Latona and turned to stone when all her children were killed with arrows, Saul, who defied the prophet Nathan, led Israel to ruin and killed himself, Arachne, who challenged Minerva in weaving and hanged herself before being changed to a spider, and Rehoboam, a haughty king of Israel who fled in fear. The final four are mortals killing and killed through greed. Eryphile, who betrayed her husband for a divine necklace and was killed by her son Alcmaeon. Sennacherib, who besieged Jerusalem and was killed by his sons while at worship. King Cyrus, beheaded by Tomyris, who immersed his head in blood and told him to drink it since he was so thirsty for it. And the Assyrian general Holofernes, who was beheaded by Judith. The 13th engraving, summing up the whole acrostic, is Proud Troy Undone. This tour de force is followed by famous lines. Morti di morti e vivi paream vivi, non vide me di me chi vide in vero. The dead seem dead and the living alive. He who saw the truth, the thing itself, did not see better than I did. And then a bitter apostrophe to us, filiali deva. Wax proud then, go your way with head held high, you sons of Eve. An angel then appears, who invites Dante and Virgil to ascend to the next ledge, lamenting that so few answer the invitation. He cancels a P from Dante's forehead, and Dante climbs a stair in the steep slope, which is compared to that of San Miniato in Florence, made when the city still had law and justice. A beatitude is sung, blessed are the poor in spirit. And Dante feels much lighter, all the remaining P's in his forehead having much faded with the conquest of pride. Dante feels with his fingers to see if the P is really gone, and Virgil smiles as to a child. There are a few perhaps incidental links to Inferno 12. We have 13 engravings, while in Inferno 12 we had 10 sinners and 3 centaurs. We have a theme of tyrannous kings, of injustice and violence. We have lots of blood, including a head immersed in blood because it so thirsted for blood. We even have a king killed at worship, like Guy de Montfort's victim Henry. The social political consequences of pride are evident here too: failed kings, strife, and the culminating image of Troy, the human city destroyed through pride. Troy becomes an image of Florence, evoked in the simile of San Miniato, a city whose pride is its own corruption. We have a steep slope between ledges, and Dante is yoked like an ox, subduing the animal, the bull, under the yoke of Christ. But I think for our purposes a deeper key is the nexus in Purgatorio 12 among art, representation, language, and pride in relation to the human, to what a human being is. A human being is the art of God. It is the self-manifestation or language of the divine, consciousness or spirit made visible. Humans are language. They are art. But humans can only fully be that if they fulfill their nature, if they know themselves, so that through them the divine becomes conscious of itself in finite form, as in Christ. Then they are logos, spirit made body, the word made flesh, consciousness or being made visible, sensible. But as a conscious being, that visible image itself speaks and says, I. It signs and represents. The word becomes image, becomes word. A human being is the perfect nexus or translation between consciousness and form, between word and image, which is why Dante assimilates himself and his art to that of an illuminator. one who is making images in text. The word or art of a fully human, a human through which the divine knows itself and speaks, itself denotes the divine. It is revelatory. It has authority. It is truth. Pride undoes all this. It is a failure to know oneself as a manifestation of the divine, as consciousness or love made visible. This failure of human self-knowledge, not to know one's own form as the language or art of God, this alienation from the ground of one's own being, is an eclipse of consciousness. It destroys meaning, signifying, communication, language, art. It undoes the incarnation and dissociates language from form, consciousness from body, the human from the divine, as in the Centaurs. It also destroys community, since it is only in the common consciousness of the one ground of being, recognizing the divine in or as oneself, and thus all possible others as not other than oneself, that we can be one, that we can communicate. Indeed, we saw that pride is intrinsically oriented towards the destruction of others, who are seen as competitors. One wants to see others lowered so one can be superior, Dante explains. Hence, the pride of Nimrod, for instance, results in multiplicities of tongues, a fracturing of community, alienation, and exile. Hence, almost every example of the acrostic depicts the destruction of the human form, of the language of God. The examples are also all pre-Christian, emphasizing that's only the awakening to Christ that can undo pride. I mentioned that the center of the triptych in Purgatorio 10, so that first set of reliefs, is David, the humble singer of God in words. At the center of the trio of souls in Purgatorio 11, we have Oderisi the Illuminator, the counter-image of Dante, who in fact, at the exact center of the entire ledge of pride, evokes Dante, unnamed, as one who may supersede his predecessors in the glory of language. Here in Purgatorio 12, at the exact center of this acrostic, as the seventh of 13 images, that's the center, we have the proud weaver of images, Arachne, alienated from the divine, competing with it, and belittling it in her weaving, her textus. Dante has poised himself, unnamed, between a humble praiser of God in words and a proud belittler of God in images, while assimilating himself to an illuminator, one who translates between word and image. This is the balance of all human life, language, representation, poised between surrender and pride. Our own body is either the language of God or its eclipse and disfiguration. And our own language or art is either the truth, the word made flesh, made word, or a false idol that eclipses and disfigures reality, its source. Art and poetry alone address and express the fullness of human nature as the fusion of spirit and body, as incarnation, which is why they can be an instrument of revelation and purgation, and why Dante writes a poem. The acrostic representation in words of images of human pride itself spells the word man. The acrostic signifies, signs human pride, as do the images it has translated into words with Arachne at their center. Thus, through this language, through these images, we can recognize ourselves, our own eclipse of language of God's human image, which is itself an awakening to the divine, a recovery of meaning. In the same way, out of the fall of Troy, the final image, comes the seed of Rome, through which justice and revelation are restored. In fact, the acrostic is a scriptural form from the Psalms, written by David. Dante is assimilating his text to Scripture and himself to David. Indeed, after the acrostic, Dante meets the beautiful angel in white, like the angels at the tomb of the risen Christ, who invites Dante and us to fly home. Paradiso 12, like Purgatorio 12, is the last of a set of 3 cantos arranged in a strictly unified scheme, although in this case we don't ascend to the next heaven until Paradiso 14. We're situated in the heaven of the sun, which we entered in Paradiso 10. As the 4th of the 9 moving heavens, the heaven of the sun is the first to be out of the shadow cast by the earth. It thus marks a key new start and corresponds in some ways to the ledge of pride, the first in Purgatory proper, after the 9 cantos devoted to Purgatory. In Paradiso 10, a ring of 12 dancing souls forms around Dante and Beatrice. These are wise, illumined souls that know themselves as not other, in some deep sense, than pure conscious being, the ground of all reality. Thus, their form, their identity, is perfectly transparent to the light. They are a ring of lights, facets or sparks of the divine, as it projects, seeks, knows itself. Aquinas, one of the lights, introduces the others, who are a mixed lot, including Albert the Great, Peter Lombard, King Solomon, Boethius, Richard of St. Victor, and Siget de Brabant, Aquinas' polemical rationalist adversary. In Paradiso 11, Aquinas observes, on the traces of Joachim the Fiore, that God sent 2 guides to renew Christ's faltering bride, the church. One seraphic in ardor, Francis, and one cherubic in wisdom, Dominic. They work to a single end. To speak of one is to speak of the other. And he embarks on a panegyric of Francis, bridegroom of poverty, that is, of renunciation and humility. And he ends then by condemning straying Dominicans. That's Aquinas, Paradiso 11. Paradiso 12 begins with a new circle of 12 lights forming around the first, like a double rainbow, perfectly corresponding to the first in movement and song, like the voice of echo. One of the lights says that the love that makes him beautiful leads him to speak of the other guide, as warriors who militated to the same end, to rally the straggling army of Christ, they should be praised together. The light is Bonaventure, who embarks on a panegyric of St. Dominic, who was born in the Occident, Calahuega, as Francis was in the Orient, Assisi, accompanied by portentous dreams and names that pointed to what he was, one who belonged entirely to God, the holy warrior of the Christian faith. Married to faith at his baptism, elected by Christ to labor in his garden, messenger and intimate servant of Christ, messo e familiar di Cristo, his first love was Christ's first commandment of poverty and humility, or perhaps the message, seek first the kingdom of God and all else will be given to you, which is true faith. Dominic sought learning not for worldly ends, but for love of the true manna, amore della verace manna, and he used it to patrol Christ's vineyard. From the Pope he sought no worldly advancement, but authority to fight for the seed that has flowered in the 24 lights, the seed of faith or revelation. Like a torrent pressed by a rising spring, he unleashed himself upon the brambles of heresy, meaning the Cathars or Albigensians, striking most where there was most resistance. That same water then became, in his followers, life-giving irrigation for the Catholic garden, l'orto cattolico. Dominic was one wheel of the war chariot by which the Holy Church defended itself. Francis was the other. But the Franciscans stray from Francis's track, weeds in a bad harvest, misled by the rigid polemical Ubertino di Casale and the compromising lax Matteo di Acquasparta. The light then reveals itself as Bonaventure, who always set aside worldly goals, and he names the other 11 lights of his ring. A chiasmus again, because that's how Aquinas started, so everything is merged. The lights, the other 11 here, include early humble Franciscans, the mystic Hugh of St. Victor, the prophet Nathan, St. Anselm, the encyclopedist Rabanus Maurus, and the grammarian Donatus. It culminates in Bonaventure's mystical adversary, Joachim of Fiore, di spirito profetico dotato, whose spiritual prophetic vision of history is actually the seed of Paradiso 11 and 12. So these two circles culminate with a figure that really is the source of them. Then, in Paradiso 13, Aquinas will explain why Solomon is the wisest of men. He is so as king. One could say also that as judge and author of the Song of Songs, Solomon fuses the chiasmus between intellect and love, faith and renunciation, and enacts it in a political, social reality. Then in Paradiso 14, Solomon speaks of the resurrection of the body, the ontological primacy of intellect to love and of love to luminosity, and a third ring of souls, a sfavilade of the Holy Spirit, encompasses the first two in a culmination of the Trinitarian imagery that permeates this heaven. We have some incidental links among our vertical cantos. Lots of military imagery here, as with the Centaurs. Maybe the Centaurs are themselves in some way a parody of the straying army of Christ. Inferno 12 had tyrants, bad military leaders. Purgatorio 12 had bad kings and generals. Here we have a true military leader, Dominic, in a true battle. We have a catalog of names, as in the acrostic, and the River of Blood. If one adds Dominic, the subject of the panegyric, to the 12 souls introduced here, we have 13, as in the acrostic, which is also 12 plus 1, and perhaps as in Inferno 12, where Chiron is in charge of 12 creatures collectively, whether centaurs or violent souls. 12 plus 1 implies Christ and his disciples, suggesting that Chiron may be a counter-Christ and his brood counter-apostles, Dominic and alter Christ, and the circle of sages alter apostles. They flower from the seed he fought for. 12 is also the number of the tribes of Israel, the community of God's people, destroyed in the 12 examples of the acrostic, and summed up in the 13th, the fall of Troy, which issues in Rome, Christ, redemption, heavenly Jerusalem. Strife and violence is implied in the battle against heresy. In fact, it was a massacre, as it also vividly was with the violent of Inferno 12 and in the acrostic of Purgatorio 12. The plays on 3 and the triptychs of the Terrace of Pride are echoed in the insistent Trinitarian imagery of the heaven of the sun. As there are 3 circles of sages in the heaven of the sun, there are 3 rings in hell's circle of violence, and a trinity of centaurs. Humility, the antithesis of pride, on the terrace in Purgatory, is a key undercurrent in the meditation on wisdom in this heaven. Pride is the most intellectual vice, and here we have sages, the contrary. The torrent, or river, of Dominic's preaching of faith counters Inferno 12's river of blood. The bodies immersed in blood, as we mentioned, might be a parody of a baptism in faith, evoked in Dominic. But I think here the key is Dominic as alter Christus, as one belonging to God, one who fuses in himself the fruition of intellect and love, or passion, consciousness and body, the divine and the human, spirit and matter, contemplation and action, word and deed, fare and dire, all of which are one in a fully realized human being, in a human assimilated to Christ. At its absolute center, in fact, both the panegyric and the canto culminate in the first triple Cristo rhyme of the poem. Dominic is venuto a questo, echoing Christ announcing his mission. Come for this. He is agricola of Christ's orto, and Christ is the ortolano eterno, the eternal gardener, and Dominic is working in his garden. In this sense, Dominic is at the other pole from the centaurs and their violent charges, who together represent the sundering of all these pairs, intellect and love, consciousness and body, the human and the divine, etc., into duality, the negation of the incarnation. In Purgatorio 12, we saw how that sundering happens through pride, through the failure of man to be logos, to translate the word into human image, into word, into revelation. It is the failure to be a finite form through which the divine knows and reveals itself. It's to see oneself not as a sign or a signifier, but simply as a material mark. Francis and Dominic re-reveal Christ. They are the rising and setting sun, sol oriens and sol occidens, incarnation and crucifixion. They image Christ so that the straying bride, the church, can come back to its groom. The chiasmus between the two cantos that makes the two panegyrics contiguous indicates that perfect love is perfect understanding and vice versa. That perfect faith is perfect renunciation of all greed and worldly ambition and vice versa. To know the ground of being in oneself, which is understanding, is to recognize all other things as oneself, which is love. It is to see the one in the many in the one. This is the foundation of all harmony and social order, as epitomized in the dancing rings. It is the negation of pride, and hence of all violence and strife. The harmony and parallel between the rings is linked to Iris, the rainbow, the messenger or link between gods and men, fulfilled then in the rainbow that sealed the covenant between God and man. The rainbow becomes an image of Christ, of the union between the divine and the human. So then why all the unsettling military imagery in this canto? The indirect evocation of the slaughter of the Albigensians. And it was a slaughter. Just at Béziers in 1209, the entire population of the town, of more than 10,000 people, was massacred, including all the children, even those who took refuge in churches. No distinction for anybody. And the military imagery, we should remember, extends to Francis too. It's not just Dominic in these cantos. Now, it's intriguing that the Cathars, or Albigensians, the Paterini in Italy, were dualists, separating body and soul, matter and spirit, the world and God, as opposing forces. Again, a negation of the incarnation, a failure of self-knowledge. But as the Centaurs indicate, and as we saw at the start, the battle of our double nature is already and always engaged. We are animals who are conscious, finite beings satiated only by infinity, in constant tension between seeking to inflate our finite sense of self by devouring the world through the senses, on the one hand, and on the other, renouncing all greed and pride by feeding on conscious being, the all-encompassing divine reality at our core. Like the Albigensians, we experience that tension as a war between opposing forces of spirit and matter, good and evil. But in reality, to fight for faith, the seed that flowers in the double ring in the heaven of the sun, is not to fight for a set of ideas, but for a deeper human self-knowledge, in which all matter, all finite reality, is revealed as the art or self-expression of the divine, apart from which it has no being at all. That battle can only be led by one who has such self-knowledge. That means one who has married poverty, which is to have renounced all greed and ambition. That renunciation is to marry faith, which is to commit to the gamble that all that exists is but a projection of a reality that we can know as ourselves. To live that commitment is to come to understand the true nature of reality, which is to love all other things as oneself. It's to have followed Francis and Dominic, Alter Christi, in the fruition of intellect and love. The true nature of reality is summed up in the Trinity. The ground of all reality, pure conscious being, is not other than its manifestation as finite form, the world, because both consist in love, the power of conscious being to give itself to, experience itself as finite form. The Trinity is what the ring of souls in the heaven of the Son both embody and sing. They are the self-manifestation of the Trinity, through which the Trinity praises and loves itself. This is the fruition of all understanding, of all art, of all revelation. Thus the sages are themselves the rainbow, the self-revelation of God to man. Joachim, who concludes these circles, saw the Trinity in history, saw the spiritual meaning in the letter of Scripture, and announced an age of true human freedom and understanding beyond all institutions and doctrines, whose harbingers were Francis and Dominic. This is the revelation of the comedy itself. In his own exam on faith, Dante will pour out the waters rising within him, as Dominic does in his preaching. Dante presents himself as another Dominic, Alter Christus, whose salvific word is experienced as a destructive torrent by those who stand against it, as life-giving water by those who open themselves to it. This battle between humility and pride, between renunciation and cupidigia, between the divine and the animal in us, that we have traced through the Canto 12s, is the only battle there is. All others are merely corollaries of it, symptoms of losing this one true war. Saint Dominic, and we are to understand our poet Dante, is a torrent of water pressed by an endless fount. That torrent, which is self-knowledge or revelation itself, both destroys delusion, the illusory, irrevocable divide between the world and its ground, and waters the garden of Christ, the faith and love that leads to the experience of all things and God as not other than oneself. That alone is the end of the war.